What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Other Guys on the Badlands Podcast Network. I'm Jake. He's Paul. The draft is over. We got a brand new team with some new uniforms since the last time we spoke. And Paul, you were at the draft party. How was it? And how are you feeling about the Jets coming out of this draft?
Draft party was great. It was good to see everybody. I mean, there's names in the Discord that float around that it's the Discord's like hot and it's always moving, right? And so, but you see a lot of the same names in there. And to be able to meet some of those people face to face and kind of put a face with the name and understand who you're talking to in there was fun. And I mean, it was a weird kind of top of the draft. Like the first few picks was like pretty boring and chalky, and then it started to get a little wild, and then the Penix Jr. pick just set everybody off. And then like from there on, it got pretty weird. Like 6 quarterbacks taken in the top 12, and then the next quarterback wasn't taken for like another hundred and something picks. So it was a weird draft. It was a fun night one. First few picks flew by, and then the latter half of the first round started to drag a little bit. I thought the live podcast was pretty good. I thought everybody did a great job. And again, it was just fun to meet everybody in person. As far as the team goes, I mean, I think the sentiment that we're hearing a lot around is like, I know we all said the Jets were pretty good last year and it was a good roster with Aaron Rodgers coming into the mix, but like this roster is so much better, right? And so it's funny, like the hindsight everybody's using to kind of to knock on last year's roster, which it did turn out to be not a very good roster. But at the time, everybody was like, wow, the Jets are good. And so to go from that to now this roster is so significantly better is pretty cool. And, I went to the Mets game with my family this weekend, and I got home last night and I was sitting around kind of reading some articles and watching the Rangers at night. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, I was like, man, like, the Jets are, looking pretty solid roster wise. The Knicks have a pretty significant lead in their first round series. The Rangers just swept their series. UConn won a national championship. The Mets are not as bad as everybody thought they were. I was sitting there last night being like, man, like I'm kind of in a pretty good time for sports here. We're looking good for New York sports, which we haven't had for a long time. So it's a nice position to be in. How was your draft?
My draft was, I mean, I will say I was a big fan of the Jets draft. We talked about this online, but I had to go deal with some family stuff in Philadelphia this weekend, which is why I couldn't make the draft party after all. But so I was watching the draft on my phone, on an airplane with shitty Wi-Fi.
Oh gosh.
And so, to your point, there were several times where, and I was watching on like the streaming from, the shitty airline, like live TV, and also had like Twitter going on my phone, but the Wi-Fi was slow. So I would like not look at Twitter if I didn't want to spoil the pick for myself. And one of the first times I happened to do that was I was like, I genuinely have no idea who the Falcons are going to pick here. So I'm just not going to spoil this myself. And like, the gasp I had on a plane full of people when it was Michael Penix, immediately going back to Twitter, just seeing like especially the first 2 days of the draft. And we'll talk about all 3 days in a second, but it's just the first 2 days of draft is like the best reality TV show on the planet where all the characters. It's them reading a list of 32 names, and it is like the most drama-filled, suspenseful, 3-hour TV show. It's not even a TV show; it's a movie at that point.
It's electric,
and it's way better than the Disney version. So it was awesome. We predicted or at least I called the right position for the drafts, not the right name on our last episode. So I was pretty proud of that. I didn't actually expect him to go offensive line, but let's dive into, we talked about the draft a little bit as a whole, but let's get very Jets specific for this podcast. We're going to go through day by day, talk about not only the picks, but also the moves, evaluate them. And I guess one last thing before we get into it, to talk about something that you were just hitting on about where the Jets are as a whole. I think last year, there was definitely optimism signing Aaron Rodgers. But if you listen to Badlands, which everyone listening to this podcast does, like you heard fans, media, talking heads all saying the same thing, which was like, we don't trust this offensive line with Dwayne Brown and Mekhi Becton as like your bookend tackles. We need a serious backup quarterback behind Aaron Rodgers. And then the season happened, and like the two biggest concerns that fans were screaming from the mountaintops since before the draft went unaddressed and were immediately problems. This year, going into the offseason, very, very similar concerns. We need to revamp the offensive line, but even after free agency, people were saying we don't have the tackle depth that we need. People were saying that we needed a backup offensive quarterback who could actually be useful. They went out and got Tyrod Taylor. People said that we needed a different backup. We needed to get Zach Wilson off the roster and get a developmental quarterback. After the draft, my biggest takeaway is that Joe Douglas has done everything that the fans and people have wanted him to address going into the season, and there's officially no excuses. So we're going to talk very optimistically about some of the things that went down, but the key reminder coming out of this is like, this shit is for real now. It is the Jets' time, and let's get into how they broke it down, because this is officially the time when the Jets should be contenders. They are all in for an all-in season, and they started that on day one. So it's pretty open now that the Jets were trying to trade up for Rome Odunze. That became not a possibility when the Bears took him at 9. The Jets executed one of my favorite moves in the draft. I tweeted about it from the plane when they did it, trading back one spot, recouping additional value, which we'll get to later, for basically nothing because they weren't going to draft a quarterback. Obviously, I saw a lot of people being like, why would Minnesota even do that? And it's like, well, Denver was right behind them, and the Raiders were right behind them. Like, there's a bunch of teams that would want to come up.
So the funny thing about that is I got a couple texts too of like, why would Minnesota move up one pick? The Jets weren't going to take JJ McCarthy. And I gave the same answer. I was like, well, Denver's right there. Oakland's right there. And the funny thing is that a couple days later, it came out like somebody did the math on draft picks and was like, Denver or Las Vegas, if they wanted to move up, could have put together the same package, which would have had more value than what Minnesota gave. So, like, the conclusion is that they weren't trying to move up. Joe Douglas just fleeced the Vikings, which is fun. Like, that's a fun thing that we just tricked them into trading up a spot.
Yeah, I mean, people get nervous on draft night, and you should exploit that if you're a good general manager. So that was one of my favorite moves on draft night until the following pick, which made me way happier. The Jets go offensive lineman. They take Olu Fashanu, I believe is how it was hammered in on draft week is the correct pronunciation. Paul, I'll start with you because you know my feelings on offensive line. What were your thoughts on the pick and the process overall?
Yeah, so one last note on the draft party. We really missed you. We wanted you there, and next time we do it, we'll have you there. The other thing was that when the Jets came up on the clock, it was like a frenetic couple of minutes because they were on the clock. Everybody thought Bowers, and then they traded out. And you probably are unaware of this if you weren't watching the live TV feed, but so, you know, they have like the team logo of the pick, and then like in the box next to it is the next pick, right? And when the trade happened, it flipped to the Minnesota logo, and then the next pick said Minnesota. And we were all like, oh my God, we traded out and we didn't even get 11.
23.
Like we slid down to 23. Are you kidding me? And there was like 2 minutes of like legit panic in the room where people were like furiously scrolling Twitter, trying to figure out what happened. And it turned out it was just like a glitch on TV. And then like a couple minutes later, NYJ popped back into that box and everybody was like, okay, fine. The other thing that hit me watching it live was that seeing the logo being used nationally really like layered it in that it's real for me. We've been wanting the 80s, 90s era uniforms for such a long time. And we got a glimpse of them last year, and then we got the unveiling a couple weeks ago and everything, but seeing the logo used nationally on TV, I was like, wow, that's what we look like now. And that's awesome. And then we get back on the clock And I think the whole room wanted Roma Dunze, and then we were like, okay, it's Bowers, right? And even on, if you go on the live pod, which is if you go to like the Badlands YouTube and click on the live section, you can see the whole recording from that night. And for that 3 minutes or so that the Jets are on the clock and it says pick is in, Joe and Will and Meigs are discussing how Bowers is going to be used in the offense. Does Nate Hackett have the ability to use Bowers the right way? Are we happy about the pick? It was like foregone conclusion. Everybody in the room, it's Bowers. And then the pick happens. You hear it announced on the live stream, and everybody is shocked except Meigs. Meigs is just like smiling ear to ear, and he starts clapping and yelling. And so I think like the room was definitely taken aback a little bit. Meigs was pumped. And then for me personally, like it took me like a minute or two and a couple deep breaths to be like, why didn't we get a weapon? Like, why did we not just get an offensive weapon when we have two starting tackles? But eventually, like the logic kicked in, and like I've been on here with you for months since we've been together saying I like taking offensive line in the first round of almost every draft because that's kind of where everything starts. And so like after a couple deep breaths and like talking to a couple people in the room, I was like, that is the really smart pick. Like that's the mature pick. It's not sexy. It's not what everybody might have wanted in the moment, but like that's what good franchises do. Like they make the right pick that, you know, and the analogy we all made was like, it's like eating your vegetables. Like we did the right thing for the first time in a long time. We did the right thing. And I keep coming back to that pod that you and I did in week 18, right before week 18, where we said, do we want to lose to Bill Belichick and get a better draft pick, or do we want to send Bill out with a loss? And the counterbalance of that argument was, if we win, we're losing out on Olu and Joe Alt, right? And we won. We got to send Bill out with a loss, and we got Olu, right? So like, if we just go back to that starting point, it's all good, and it was the right pick. And so like, while it shocked me, at the end of the day, I walked away happy. Like I drove home from the draft party that night being like, man, like that was really smart. That was really good. We're not relying on Max Mitchell and Carter Warren and potentially Bakhtiari for depth anymore. We have a real swing tackle who, by the way, worked on the right side in his offseason, who was at one point in time pretty much a consensus top 5 pick, and we got him at 11, and we recouped some other picks back. So hard for me to say anything negative about how it all went down. I'm sure Brock Bowers is going to be great, but I'm sure Olu is going to be very good also.
Yeah, I think you know, we talked for you hit the nail on the head with the week 18 analogy. Like I think we've talked for months about how offensive line would be the smart pick, and then there became so much Brock, Adunze, what weapon are we going to get discourse that kind of storyline got pushed to like third or fourth rank in terms of like what was being talked about amongst Jets fan circles, to the point where like you said, it was a foregone conclusion we were going to take a weapon. Just which one was it? We ended up with the second offensive lineman on Connor's big board. I feel like a lot of Jets fans were really hoping that Latham wasn't the pick. So to see him go at 7 was, kind of like a big sigh of relief of like, okay, like we're either going to get an O lineman or one of Rome or Bowers will be there. Which ended up being the case. And I think most people leapt to the conclusion that it was going to be Bowers then. But, like you said, the Jets ate their vegetables. They did the smart thing for the long term. I've talked a little bit about how, like, my wife has become like a baseline Jets fan where, she watches every game now. She doesn't like fully understand football, but she asks a lot of questions and I'm happy to explain stuff. And so like she's learning at a rapid rate. And we got off the plane and she was like, how is the draft? Did the Jets do something good? And I was like, they drafted an offensive lineman. And she goes, thank God. And if someone with like that level of like has been watching football for 1 year can understand the importance of keeping Aaron Rodgers upright, like every Jets fan should be happy about this, because at the base level, we are doing what we need to do. The argument that, oh, we took a backup position when we're supposed to be a win now team. I've said this about 1 million times. it is a virtual guarantee that Olu Fashanu starts games next season at
Mhm.
either tackle spot. And, you know, we just went through this whole thing with Mackay, who we also drafted at 11, where he wanted to be a left tackle and blah, blah, blah. Olu at his first press conference is saying, like, put me wherever you need me. I just want to win. I'm a team guy. He's being comped to Debrickashaw Ferguson. Like, this is, it took him a bunch of tries, but if Joe Douglas finally gets us a bookend left tackle that'll be here for 10 years, I don't care that it took him this many tries. Like, if Olu is the guy that he is comped to be, then no one in their right mind will complain about this pick 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 10 years from now. So very, very relieved that this is how day one went for the Jets.
Agreed. And I just want to piggyback on a point you just made. So I don't want to give any other Jets shows free press here, but AVT was live on something on camera during the draft, right? And so like it all kind of happens, the trade happens, and then they're like, AVT, what do you think? Right. And he's like effusive in praise, and I don't want to start shit, and I don't want to say things that could potentially like whatever. I don't want to say anything bad about Mekhi Becton, but AVT said in his live, unfiltered reaction to the pick that he's really happy about where the room is right now, and that it's all team guys and nobody who is me first, right? That was like his unfiltered reaction to taking a new left tackle, was that everybody is team focused in the room now. And like, why would you say that if it was always like that, right? And so I thought that was just like an interesting tidbit that I pulled out of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, live reactions are always the best because that's the kind of unfiltered response that you get. And I don't know that he would have said that at like a press conference the day after with Jets
Right.
media. So shout out to the folks who got AVT live during the draft. That's an awesome get. Let's go to day two. So I think after the Jets pulled off the trade back and recouped some extra fourth round capital, a lot of people were saying, let's use that. Let's trade up into round two and let's get one of these receivers. There was a run on receivers early. A lot of people, I should say, a lot of people wanted to point out, like, hey, there's a run on receivers going down. There's still plenty of receiver options left. Who would you take at tackle today? You know, so I think a lot of people who were anti drafting an offensive tackle in round one over a receiver kind of had their medicine given to them on day two once they saw the disparity between who was available and who was not. However, so despite the fans wanting the Jets to trade up into round two, they don't. They execute a trade to get up to the beginning of round three, and they get their guy, which was evidenced by the text the Jets shared between Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh, where they went full draft day, Malachi Coleman, no matter what. And what are your thoughts, Paul, on the Jets acquiring? I'm scared to call him the Yak King because I don't want Golden Tate to come after me on Twitter. What are your thoughts on getting the Yak King in the building?
I had no idea Golden Tate thought of himself as the Yak King until that retweet, which is funny. But so yeah, I loved the pick. I was actually, me and Meegs and a group of people were talking about Malachi Corley at the party during round one. Kind of just being like, what do you think about him, right? And so there was a lot of conversation that was fresh on my brain heading into day two, and I love the pick. I think, comparing him to Deebo Samuel is lofty, just because of the impact that he's had on the 49ers the last couple of years. So like, let's see first. Cordero Patterson feels like a more realistic kind of comp, but the tape is awesome. Like he's like a fun player to watch. He almost gave me like Quincy Enunwa Kachary vibes, just to try to compare it to a Jet. Like, I'm not sure we've ever had a player like Corley, but to just trying to compare him to a Jet, it just gave me like Quincy Enunwa, Jericho Kachary type feel.
There were a lot of highlights going around the timeline of Quincy like breaking tackles and running through. So like I think other Jets fans were making that comparison as well, even if the body type isn't necessarily accurate.
Yeah, and Quincy's a player that like we all long for the fact that we didn't get him for as long as we should have gotten him for.
Yeah.
He had a couple like eye-popping highlights. There's one, I think it's against Cleveland, where it felt like he broke like 30 tackles on one catch and run. And so I think that's the type of player we're getting. Um, it was cool that they were able to like get down into round 3 and still grab them. They seem to this like Joe D has a penchant for waiting until a round turns over and getting up into the top pick in the next round to take their guy. I think they did that with Breece Hall. I think they like kind of close to did that with Elijah Moore too, if memory serves. But like they love like letting a round play through and then getting into the top pick of the next round. And so, I think like live while it was happening, everybody like, Jalen Polk was like the name everybody wanted to go up and get, but then he went pretty quick in round 2. And like the name started to slide off the board a little bit. And it was essentially like him and Troy Franklin were kind of still sitting there later. And we got up and got the guy. And I love the pick. I like, I guess, how they did it. The pick trades got weird later on, but up to that point, it all felt like they were doing the right thing and they were kind of going by their board. And then the Jets like opened their mouths and started talking about how Corley was always their guy and they had him as the 4th wide receiver on the board and they would have taken him. Yeah. And like, for me, it's like, okay, I get you want to build the guy up and I get you want to have, good sound bites and good press and all that. But like, can you just say less? Like we don't need to say all that, because what that creates on the other side is everybody dragging them for being like, wow, he was the 4th wide receiver on your board and you didn't pick him till round 3. You didn't read the board correctly, all this stuff. And like, I think at the end of the day, they did kind of read things correctly because they did know that they could wait until round 3 and get up to the first pick. Like they did kind of do it right, but then they go out and open their mouths and say all this stuff and it makes them look bad. So like, I think my only note on the Malachi Corley pick is like, just shut up afterwards. Like be happy you got your guy, share the text message out. That's fine. But we don't need to like add all this extra stuff to it about, what you thought of him and all that. Like just get the guy in the building and let's get to work here. So love the pick. Didn't love the press afterwards. But I think, and this is not like